In a few days' time, it will be May 15th, which, as many of you know, is the day that Palestinians mark the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which began in 1947 and continued into the early 1950s. And in fact continues until this day. It's very important not to think of the Nakba, although we think of it in the past and we think of it as something to commemorate and memorialize, to remember that the Nakba, the catastrophe of the destruction of Palestine by the Zionists, is an ongoing Nakba, an ongoing catastrophe, and it continues for all of us. It continues for the people in Palestine, it continues for the refugees who have been denied their right to return home by Israel on the purely racist grounds that they're not Jews, and it continues indeed for the whole region where Israel continues to generate so much strife and so much conflict. But nevertheless, 63 years after the beginning of the Nakba, we can celebrate that we are all here as Palestinians. We saw the beautiful young children celebrating Palestine and continuing with Palestinian traditions and heritage for another generation. We can celebrate the fact that, as Jeff said, Palestine is not just a symbol of oppression for people around the world, but a symbol of resistance, a symbol of survival, a symbol of undying hope and determination to be free. We can celebrate the fact that 63 years after the Zionist ethnic cleansing of Palestine began, there are more Palestinians living within historic Palestine today than ever before. There are now more than 5 million Palestinians in Palestine, and their number is roughly equal to the number of Israelis, if not slightly more. So within Palestine, there are more Palestinians living than ever before. We also now, since 2011, it seems like this year started a decade ago, doesn't it? With all that has happened in the region. We celebrate and congratulate our brothers and sisters from Tunisia and from Egypt for inspiring us with their revolutions. Incredible, courageous uprisings that restored, I think, our hope that radical change is possible, that liberation is possible. And what we saw beginning in Sidi Bouzid, when Mohammed Bouazizi decided that he had had enough and undertook a terribly tragic act of protest, one which cost him his life. But he lit a fire that really is sweeping across the region and I think across the world. And what started in Tunisia and Egypt and Yemen and in Syria and in other countries, I think is going to continue. I think we're only at the very beginning of the momentous changes that will happen in the region. And there are going to be terrible ups and downs on the way. We've seen that one model that we saw in Tunisia and Egypt, where things followed a certain path of popular protests, and then the regime trying to give concessions, and that not working to placate people or to appease them, and then the regime cracking down, and then changing the government, and then going through all these gimmicks until finally the president makes a speech where he says, "I will never ever leave," and then the next day he leaves. And that model, unfortunately, was not repeated in Libya, where we've seen a Western military intervention, which I think, rather than helping to hasten the demise of the regime, has transformed the situation in Libya into an open-ended civil war, which I think is going to cost many lives. But we stand with the people of Libya, nevertheless, in their efforts to overthrow the dictatorial regime which they have suffered under for so long. And we express our solidarity with people in Syria, where there is never an excuse, there is never an acceptable reason for a government to turn guns on its own people, as we have seen in Syria. But despite these terrible ups and downs, I'm convinced that the process that started is going to continue, and that people will insist on being free. And not only will this have a transformative effect within Arab countries, but it's very important on a regional level, because what we're also seeing with the Arab uprisings and revolutions is the crumbling of a regional system that has existed since 1945, since the end of World War II, when the old colonial powers in the region, Britain and France, sailed off into the sunset, and the new imperial power rode onto the scene, being, of course, the United States. And for the past few decades, we've had a regional system in which the United States, along with Israel, dominates the region with the assistance of client regimes and dictatorships at the expense of the people of the region. And that system is starting to come unstuck, as we see Egypt. Even though Egypt's revolution is not yet complete, even though there is still a long struggle for people in Egypt to see the kind of country and society that they want and deserve, nevertheless we see Egypt returning to its central regional role, which is not just a geopolitical role, although that's important, where Egypt is changing the narrative that has been imposed by Israel and the United States, and to a large extent Saudi Arabia, of moderates versus extremists, of Sunni versus Shia, this ugly sectarian rhetoric which none of us want and none of us believe in. And Egypt is rebuilding its relations with Iran, is taking a firmer line with Israel and saying, well, we have a peace treaty with Israel, but a peace treaty doesn't require us to go to war against the Palestinians and to go to war against our other Arabs and to stand silent while Israel commits crimes at the expense of our Arab brothers and sisters. So Egypt is already beginning to shift back to a central role in the region, and that will continue, and it will have big implications. Egypt will also, I think, return to its central cultural and media role, where we will see Cairo once again becoming the important center of media and literature that it has always been, but was so much suppressed under the dictatorship. And of course, these changes will have an impact in Palestine, and already are. And we've seen some momentous events in the past few days and weeks that I want to talk about, and I think are important. We have seen, just in the past few days, the two main factions in Palestine signing a reconciliation agreement, a unity agreement. Hamas and Fatah, of course. And I don't think there is a single Palestinian, I've never met one, who is against unity, who wants to see Palestinians divided, who doesn't yearn for Palestinians to be a united front in the face of the oppression that they're struggling against. But I have some real questions about this unity agreement that I worry could lead us once more into a dead end. And I agree with Jeff that we need to avoid such dead ends. We need to ask ourselves what the essence of unity is. What is it that we are united about? If this is unity between factions so they can share seats in a Palestinian Authority that has no real power over the lives of Palestinians and simply serves as a fig leaf for the occupation. That might be unity that serves them, but it doesn't serve the Palestinian people. If it's a unity which is on a platform dealing only with internal matters in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, we want the best for our brothers and sisters in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. But we have to be careful not to allow the Palestinian national movement and the Palestinian struggle to be reduced to the municipal affairs of the West Bank and Gaza Strip and who holds which ministry and who does what. The Palestinian issue is much bigger than the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and it involves the refugees in the diaspora, all of us, or many of us here in this room, and the Palestinians within the 1948 areas, the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And none of us have had a voice in any of this, and so that is crucially important. The other thing that you will not hear me doing very often is agreeing with Benjamin Netanyahu. But he said something that I think ought to make us reflect. He said when this unity deal was announced that Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, had to choose peace with Israel or peace with Hamas. And in a sense, he's right, because in practice, the Palestinian Authority of Abbas has had a kind of a peace with Israel. Not justice, but peace. And this is in the form of what they call a security coordination, where the Palestinian security forces are actually working very, very closely with the Israeli army, largely to suppress Hamas, but not only Hamas. They also have arrested many Palestinians from many other factions, many activists engaged in the nonviolent struggle against the occupation. They've shut down hundreds of charities, and it's very clear the United States, which supplies the aid, the military aid to the Palestinian Authority, has made it very clear that the job of the Palestinian security forces is to help Israel to crack down on opposition to the occupation. So the first question, if we say end the division, and this is the slogan that has come from the young people in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, end the division. Before we say end the division, we have to say end the unity. End the unity between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli occupation. End the unity between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli occupation. End security coordination. End the situation where Palestinian security forces armed and trained at great expense sit idly by while Palestinian farmers, trees and crops and homes are destroyed by the settlers, and these highly paid security forces do nothing to protect them. Palestinian security forces that only work to protect the settlers and to arrest Palestinians are Palestinian only in name. So I have to insist on this point and be very firm. End the unity before we can end the division. If not, what is going to happen? We're going to have a situation where you have a continued relationship between Abbas and Israel and a relationship between Abbas and Hamas. And it will be quiet as long as Hamas maintains a ceasefire, as it's said that it's interested in doing. But what happens when Israel, as it routinely does, decides to break the ceasefire and carries out an atrocity in Gaza, and Palestinian resistance fighters there respond? What will happen? How can you maintain unity between one half of the Palestinian people that's under attack by the Israeli army, at war with the Israeli army, and the other half that is going on joint patrols with the Israeli army? It's not possible. So, whereas all of us share the desire for unity, unity has to be built on a principled platform. And this has nothing to do with factions. Because when I listened to the speeches in Cairo the other day, I didn't hear any principles that really spoke to me being addressed by any of those leaders. And I want to come back to what I think the principles we should stand on are. But before that, I want to say something about the issue which Jeff raised, which is very important. The plan by the Palestinian Authority to go to the UN General Assembly in September and call for the recognition of the State of Palestine within the 1967 boundaries. The reasoning behind this, and I share Jeff's hope, even though we disagree on this somewhat, I share his hope that it could be a turning point. But I think we also have to temper our enthusiasm and recognize here again the potential pitfalls. By the way, this isn't all going to be doom and gloom. There's going to be some good news. But the reasoning that Palestinian Authority officials have given for this move is they believe, and I'm quoting now from Riyad al-Malki, one of the Palestinian Authority officials in Ramallah, recognition of a Palestinian state by the UN would create political and legal pressure on Israel to withdraw its forces from the land of another state that is recognized with the 1967 borders. And similarly, Nabil Shath, another Ramallah official, told the New York Times that, I quote, Israel, if a Palestinian state were recognized, Israel would then be in daily violation of the rights of a fellow member state, and diplomatic and legal consequences could follow, all of which would be painful for Israel. Now, wouldn't that be nice if that would happen? The problem is there's no reason to believe that this will happen based on everything we've seen up to this point, at least on that reasoning. Of course, let's remember that Lebanon has been a member state of the United Nations since it was founded in 1945, and Syria as well. And that has not stopped Israel from occupying large parts of Lebanon and Syria for decades at a time, with no international pressure whatsoever on Israel to withdraw. On the contrary, Syria and Lebanon are told that you have to give guarantees to the occupier before we ask the occupier to do anything. And there's no reason to believe it would be any different in the case of Palestine. What worries me is that the Palestinian leadership up till now have had a strategy that is based solely on diplomatic symbolism, on getting Palestine recognized. You know, they declared a state in 1988, before many of the people in this room were born. And it has been recognized now by more than 100 countries. It didn't change the reality on the ground. It doesn't matter how many PLO missions are recognized as embassies around the world. It doesn't change the reality on the ground. We have seen so many UN decisions in favor of Palestine, dozens of resolutions. The International Court of Justice decision in 2004 saying that the wall Israel is building in the West Bank is illegal and must be torn down. But these resolutions remain words on paper because there is no enforcement. So we don't need more resolutions from the United Nations, and another resolution, even one recognizing Palestine, will not change that. And even worse is a danger that rather than being a step towards true liberation, the world says, well, we recognize the state for you. What more do you want? And forget about the rights of refugees. Forget about the rights of Palestinians living in the Galilee, in Nazareth, in Akka, and Haifa, and Jaffa, who are also struggling to maintain their resistance. So there are real dangers in these strategies that don't pay attention to the reality on the ground. So, with that, I want to move to the good news. What does a real unity platform look like? It's not something that we have to imagine because it already exists. And I believe that the 2005 Palestinian civil society call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is the real unity platform for all Palestinians, regardless of where they live, regardless of whether they support a political faction or not, regardless if they believe in one state or two states or 10 states. This is the unity platform. For those who don't know what the 2005 BDS call is, I will give a very brief description. This was inspired by what our South African brothers and sisters did in order to advance their struggle to end apartheid in South Africa. In 2005, hundreds of Palestinian civil society organizations signed a call calling on international civil society to impose boycotts, to divest from Israel, and to advocate sanctions until Israel recognizes and implements Palestinian human rights. And three demands in particular. The first, that Israel must end its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands occupied since 1967. Second, that Israel must end all forms of discrimination, abolish all laws and practices that make Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in 1948, unequal. It must give them full equality. And third, to respect, promote, and implement the rights of Palestinian refugees, including the right of return. I've never met a single Palestinian who would not unify around those three demands because they include the rights and the interests of all Palestinians. I think we are at the end of this conflict. I can't tell you whether it's a year or 2 years or 5 years or 10, but Zionism in Palestine is reaching a dead end. It's reaching a demographic dead end, where Palestinians, as I mentioned, are now once again on the verge of becoming a majority once again. It is reaching a moral dead end, where it's no longer possible for Israeli officials to stand up and to justify to reasonable people the actions that Israel is taking. And it is reaching a political dead end. Even here in this country, have you noticed the change, the shift in the discourse of supporters of Israel? Where has Israel's support base moved in this country? It's moved to the very far right. It's moved to the most Islamophobic, the most racist, the most xenophobic segments of this country and its political elite. In a way, I think this should encourage us, because it goes to show that the support for Israel's oppression and apartheid now exists among the most extreme people. And it is up to us to go out and win the rest. And I really believe we can do it. I want to end, I know that we're starting, I can hear some of the stomachs rumbling out there in the room. I know mine is. I want to end by coming back to the Nakba. You know, Everything I learned about Palestine, I learned from my parents, like many of us. My parents are both born in Palestine. Alhamdulillah, they're both in good health. They live in Amman. They both left Palestine at an early age. My mother from the village of Lifta, which has been in the news a lot because it's one of the few intact Palestinian villages that was depopulated. In any other country, a place like Lifta would be declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site and it would be protected. Not just Lifta, but other places too, to preserve what's left of Palestinian heritage that has not yet been destroyed. But Lifta is now targeted for destruction by Israel to turn it into luxury Jews-only condominiums. And there is a campaign to save Lifta. Lifta, though, is a symbol for all Palestinian villages and for the possibility of return. We have to think of return as real, not imaginary, because Lifta is there and the people of Lifta are there. They're just separated. And they're separated by a racist system that says you can't come back to this place that you belong to because you're from the wrong religion. And that kind of racism that is at the heart of Zionism is really what stands in the way of justice. But when I think about my parents, and I hope they will always stay in good health, but I think about the 63 years they've lived since the Nakba. And I know that many others in this room have parents and grandparents who had similar experiences. That we owe it to them to see justice, not just in the lifetimes of the beautiful young children who opened this evening, but in the lifetimes of our parents and grandparents. And that is the time scale that I am working on. I believe that we should look for a dramatic transformation in the situation in Palestine, not in 50 years or 30 years, but in 5 years. And I believe it's possible if we continue to build the momentum of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Thank you very much.